David Hicks has never been connected to any terrorist act. In early September 2001, having completed 4 courses over a 9-month period in Afghanistan, he says he planned to return to Australia to visit family. But first, he had to renew a long-expired Pakistan visa. He went across the border to Quetta to begin the process.
The first was an American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767.
A day or so after his return to Pakistan, he was watching television when the news of the 9/11 attacks broke.
I think it was a disgusting act, and so many people lost their life on that day. It's hard to describe when you're watching something like that it's even possible that it could happen. I mean, the devastation and the people jumping from the building, and when they collapsed, and it was horrible.
At this point, David Hicks made one of the most fateful decisions of his life. He says he returned to Kandahar in Afghanistan to collect belongings he'd left behind. In his book published last year, he claims these included his passport, but previously he said he had his passport with him. It's one of many discrepancies in his story that rile those who are convinced he returned to join Al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
I mean, I just think it's fanciful. It strikes me as being utterly incredible that you would go back into Afghanistan to collect your passport. You'd go to the Australian Embassy and get a new passport.
Why didn't you go back and get your gear and get straight back into Pakistan?
I didn't feel an urgency, and there was some rumour or some concern, but it was slight, that there may be some type of airstrike or some type of retaliation because Afghanistan was being blamed for September 11th. There was some speculation that, based on how the US had dealt with Afghanistan in the past, you know, that there might be a few cruise missiles or something, and that would be the end of it. Nothing more.
With nearly 3,000 innocent civilians dead, the US launched a new type of war on terror. Australia, the United Kingdom and a NATO alliance pledged support.
Those responsible for this despicable series of attacks upon the United States will be hunted down and meted out the justice that they so much deserve.
Suspicion immediately fell on Al-Qaeda, and 6 days after the 9/11 attacks, President Bush publicly named Osama bin Laden as the prime suspect. When and how did you find out that Osama bin Laden was responsible or might be responsible for the 9/11 attacks?
I can't remember exactly at what point that I heard that Osama bin Laden was being blamed for September 11th. But it wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't till Guantanamo Bay, because it wasn't till Guantanamo Bay that was the first time I'd even heard a word of Al-Qaeda.
Yes, but I'm not asking about Al-Qaeda, I'm asking about Osama bin Laden, and I think in your book you say that bin Laden was being blamed for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So
if it's in my book, then...
So my question is, when did you find out that Osama bin Laden was responsible for the 9/11 attacks?
I'd have to refer to my book.
Can't you remember?
No.
Thank you very much for your time.
Previously, he said he heard the allegations against bin Laden early on, while in Kandahar. In his book, he says it was in Afghanistan, but not until a few weeks after the atrocity. After stopping the interview to check the book, David Hicks answered the question again.
Yeah, I reckon I first heard allegations that bin Laden was involved in September 11th in some way by BBC Radio when I was looking after the Taliban tank south of Kandahar, and it wasn't the best. It wasn't a good feeling to hear that. Please excuse my writing.
That's okay. Critics of his story say he's fudging the truth, and that he didn't simply become trapped in Afghanistan without options after the border to Pakistan closed. What he did was take direction from an Arab leader in Kandahar.
Thank you so much.
Who was this person and who was he affiliated with?
He never identified himself as belonging to anyone. He never even gave us his name. There was one time, though, he referred to himself as once being in the Egyptian Air Force, the rank of colonel or something.
This man was later identified by the US as high-ranking al-Qaeda leader Saif al-Adel.
He made the deliberate effort to leave Pakistan, go back to Afghanistan, report in to Saif al-Adel, who was a senior member of the terrorist community, and in essence say, I'm David Hicks, I'm reporting for duty.
David Hicks now claims he was forced to meet with al-Adel. Whatever the reason, it's clear he was sent to a training camp facility near the airport. He was there when US airstrikes began in early October.
And I became very scared. And it was at that point that I decided, out of an instinct to survive, for survival, I decided to arm myself and to wear a military uniform.
Although the Taliban government was now America's enemy, David Hicks says he joined with their forces at this point as part of a foreign volunteer militia and was initially assigned to guard the tank. He then headed to the front line near Kunduz, north of Kabul. It was November and much of Afghanistan was at war. As well as the international crisis, the country's northern alliance, backed by the US, was bearing down on the Taliban, rapidly taking control of the country. The front line in the north was no exception. It fell within hours of David Hicks's arrival.
When that front line collapsed, the next morning, when the sun had risen, there were about 30 bodies of the people I'd been with who had been shot and half their heads were blown away. So here I was, personally looking at witnessing of the destruction and needless death of war. And, it sent a message and made me view everything in a totally different way because I had not had that experience up till then.
David Hicks claims he never fired a shot during the war. Returning to Kunduz, he deserted the collapsing Taliban militia and sold his weapon to fund an escape. Dressed in local Farsi clothing, he took a taxi, hoping to get through to Pakistan. But the Northern Alliance was on the hunt. Its mission, backed by the US, was to round up anyone associated with the Taliban or al-Qaeda. Foreign militia were highly prized and large bounties were being offered. While trying to change taxis in Baghlan, the first major town south of Kunduz, David Hicks was arrested.
I was scared and I was hopeful. I asked if they could hand me over to United Nations or an NGO. Instead, a few days later, they tied my biceps together behind my back, threw me in a car, drove me to the neighbouring town of Mazar-e-Sharif, and then handed me over to US forces for, I believe, $5,000, and that began my 6 years of hell.
David Hicks's arrest in Afghanistan shocked Australia. Until then, he was unknown to Australian authorities. But in ASIO raids, including on his father's home in Adelaide, the letters he'd written to his family were seized.
The letters, they thought they had a field day. If we knew that these letters was going to cause so much contention, I suppose, we would have destroyed them. Now that one returned to
Terry Hicks would go on to become his son's greatest supporter. But when the news broke, even he was taking a hard line. He revealed to the media that he'd spoken with his son by satellite phone after he'd joined up with the Taliban and couldn't talk him out of it.
I don't care who it is. If you've broken a law, then you face the consequences of a court. If you're found guilty, so be it. We all wear it. If you're not guilty, well, then you go home and whatever. But that didn't eventuate.
While held in Afghanistan, David Hicks was interrogated by the US and by Australia's Federal Police and ASIO. He claims the first US interview was particularly confronting.
Guns were pointed at me most of the time. I was threatened. They threatened to shoot me. There was a shotgun. Most of them had M16s, but one had a shotgun they said was specially for me in case I made the wrong move.
Whatever moral judgments might be made about the prisoners' association with the Taliban, one aspect was clear. The Taliban forces at the time were officially the army of Afghanistan's government.
This man was purchased by the Americans from the people that had captured him, and he was not being treated, if he was a prisoner of war, as a prisoner of war, and if he wasn't a prisoner of war, they had no basis for taking him.
When you take up arms on the battlefield and you're captured, then throughout history of armed conflict, detaining the enemy is appropriate.
I told him everything up front from the beginning. Being soldiers, I expected them to understand the realities of the situation.
For a month, David Hicks was transported between US warships and land bases. During this time, he says he was hooded, had his head rammed into asphalt, and was often beaten. On 2 occasions, he says those beatings in an airport hangar ran for as long as 8 or 10 hours.
Both times were practically exactly the same. So there were 7 of us. They placed us in a half circle in a hangar, and they would kick us and spit on us and whisper threats into our ears. And then I felt a few nudges in the back of my head, which was the butt of a rifle. And then I was hit hard enough in the back of the head that it knocked me to the ground. Then I was taken to Kandahar Airport, where we lived in cages made of rolled up razor wire. And there was sexual humiliation there. I had this big plastic thing rammed up my anus. They just did horrible, terrible, degrading things to us in Kandahar. I was made to lie down in the mud. It was raining at the time. We were beaten. That's when I had my right hand fractured, because our hands had to be behind our backs. They were chained behind our backs. Then they would stand with their full weight of their military boots on your hands, or they would kick it. So that's when they broke, and they would hit us on the head with plastic pipes. And it's just general mistreatment.
In January 2002, David Hicks was among the first detainees transferred to the notorious prison at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba.
I was terrified. Upon arriving in Guantanamo, there's lots of yelling, lots of abuse, lots of dogs, lots of slapping, a lot of hitting, a lot of kneeling on stones. We were put in the first camp called Camp X-Ray that consisted of a cement foundation upon which they built 10 wire cubicles. And that's all it was. So we were exposed to the wind and the sun and the rain. There were scorpions and snakes and tarantulas and all types of animals that were being disturbed, that were running through the cages. So lucky I wasn't bitten by anything, but so it was just living outside in the dog kennel, basically.
David Hicks spent 3 months in Camp X-Ray before being moved to Camp Delta, built of shipping containers. A year later, he was transferred to a tiny cell in a new facility, Camp Echo.
I was kept there in total isolation for 16 months, the first 8 months of which I never saw the sun once. And my nickname from the military police was Casper, because of how white I'd become from not seeing the sun.
It's important to recognize, in the case of isolation, that we get both physical and psychological effects, which, in my view, now moves isolation in the realm of physical torture and not merely psychological.
Professor Darius Rajali is an international torture expert who has studied the Hicks case.
Yes, I think David Hicks was tortured. Once you have been subjected to torture, you will never be normal, ever.